There we are, and we are recording. So I'm going to go ahead and share my other screen here, and we'll get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Just barely afternoon here, and we're getting started right on time. I'm John Humphreys. I'm the Executive Director of the Association for Equity and Funding, and happy to talk with you about our budget priorities for the next biennium, which will start just in 7 months or so. Wanted to share a little bit of background for today, background about AEF and our progress and our positions, where we've come from. I want to talk about the impacts that revenue limits have had on students all across the state. And I want to share our ask for the next biennium, how we're positioned, and talk a little bit about what's going to potentially come next for AEF. AEF is the Wisconsin Association for Funding, Equity and Funding. 68 school districts at this morning's count, educating 83,000 students, about 10% of the state. 16-member steering committee. You can find everybody's contact information on our website. And our chair, John Geyer, is with us this afternoon. I see John there. And I also see our treasurer, Janelle Maratz, who's the business official in Denmark. The Constitution in Wisconsin guarantees that the legislature shall provide by law for school districts which shall be as nearly uniform as practicable. And one of the things I've shared with the legislators is that our system is not very uniform with regard to revenues, and that's, we think, has been unconstitutional in the past. AEF actually considered a lawsuit about that, or I should say a second lawsuit about that issue recently, and we decided we've made some good progress. I'll talk more about that in a little while. The revenue limits can also be considered spending caps. The system goes back 30 years, and the baseline, the benchmark, was set in 92, 93, and it was based on what the school district spent in that year. Nobody knew it was coming. There's nothing they could do about it. Some were spending to build new buildings or buy curriculum or outfit buildings that they had already built. Others were tightening their belts. And ever since then, their benchmark has been set. And I'm going to show you how it's been very difficult for districts to break out of the low revenue, high revenue situations. There was no logic or rationale. This is the school board's journal from 1993, and this was Governor Tommy Thompson, who said at the bill signing of the budget at the bottom there, "I can assure you we will continue to look at the equity question this fall and come forward with a plan for the next biennial budget." This is what revenues looked like per pupil in that year, in the 93-94 school year. And you can see it's a pretty significant distribution. A lot of districts clustered about that $5,500 to $5,800 level, but there were districts spending more than $8,600 per pupil, and that's 30 years ago. But even though the governor said he would come back and look at the equity issue that fall, by 1995, the cost controls was the new term, should be made permanent. And they promised new flexibility. Well, AEF was formed in 1992 to promote financial equity, and they proposed legislation in 93, which was basically ignored. In 1994, AEF studied the feasibility of a lawsuit, and in 95, that lawsuit was filed. That was called Vincent versus Voigt. I'll come back to that here in a few minutes. But by 22-23, just 2 years ago, 125 districts were at the lowest level of funding. That was $10,000 per pupil, and about 300 districts with higher funding. And a few lucky school districts are here in blue. Many of you have seen this map. We've used this as our main teaching tool, and it is available on our website. It's something that really opened a lot of eyes in key legislators across the state, school board members, parents, etc. And I think a lot of people saw this as an issue around competitiveness, about fairness, and, as the name would imply, about equity. So really a lot of eye-opening conversations based on that map. Over the years, then, we've had a lot of studies looking at the impacts of revenue limits, and I want to share just a few of the most recent findings. In 2021, R.W. Baird helped us create what we call data dashboards showing the long-term impacts of revenue limits on school districts across the state. And I want to call out Mount Horeb's example. This is one chart that was on the data dashboard for the Mount Horeb area school district. And you can see the blue line is the average revenue limit per pupil. And in the orange line, that was the school district's revenue limit per pupil. And that differential between the district and the average added up every year over the years. In 2021, it was almost $3 million higher in just that 1 year. But if the revenue limit had been at the state average for those 30 years, Mount Horeb would have had $46 million more to educate their students. That number is really important because you may recall that Mount Horeb had a school shooting incident last year. And AEF made the correlation in an op-ed in June about the correlation between the revenue limit, the $46 million essentially a deficit, and Mount Horeb's two referenda, 2017 and 2022, totaling $43 million. In fact, Steve may even be on the call this afternoon. Steve is going to be one of our guests at our session at the school boards conference in January, and he'll talk about the correlation between the revenue limit and what they were able to do to ensure school safety. So we made that correlation. We essentially argued that, at least in the case of Mount Horeb, the voters had to step up with a referendum to ensure that students were being kept safe. And we made the argument that shouldn't that be the case for all students across the state? Shouldn't every student have an equal opportunity, not only to a great education, but to school safety? We also worked with Dr. Jesse Rothstein from University of California, Berkeley, to look at student proficiency. This was a lead up to our potential follow-up lawsuit to the Vincent Voigt case. And Dr. Rothstein looked at revenue limits over time. What you see across the bottom axis here are the revenue limits in 1994. So all the way from $4,000 to $6,000 or $12,000. The vertical axis is the revenue limits in 2019. And what you see in that arrow in the upper left-hand corner is that there are very few or zero, really, districts that went from a low revenue limit in 1994 to a higher revenue limit in 2019, or a substantially higher revenue limit as compared to the average. So a lot of the districts are clustered in this area. If they were high in 1994, they were high in 2019. Nobody's over here. You can't break out of the low revenue trap. It's very difficult. Interestingly, Dr. Rothstein identified that academic achievement is not correlated with revenue limits. And in fact, in the case of the third grade forward results, there was a negative correlation with higher revenue limits leading to more lower outcomes for students all across the board. College enrollment rates, however, were found to correlate closely with revenue limits. And so you see a significant improvement in college enrollment rates with the higher revenue limit. Let's see, somebody just called me, and I'm worried that people are not able to get in. I did have to let somebody in, but I think it looks like we're okay. So I'm going to continue. So Dr. Rothstein's conclusions: revenue limits are persistent. They're closely tied to spending levels, obviously. If you don't get the revenue, you can't spend the money. They're loosely correlated with family income, and there's very little or a negative correlation to student achievement outcomes, probably because there's a lot of stuff tied to student achievement. But higher revenue limits were correlated with higher post-secondary enrollment. That's important. I then used the Munetrics data system and their platform to do analyses of staffing and spending. And what we found were some really important trends. On a per pupil basis, low revenue districts are much less likely to have the most favorable student to teacher ratios. They're more likely to have lower spending per pupil on elementary teachers and less likely to have the highest spending. So it's just this pattern. It says, in essence, both at elementary and secondary level, students in low revenue districts experience structural challenges. It's not fair. It's not competitive. It's not equitable. We also looked at counselors, nurses, and library media specialists. Those three groups are specifically called out in the state standards with regard to staffing levels. And we looked at those and we found that students in low revenue districts have access to significantly fewer counselors, nurses, and library media specialists. Another important finding. Just speaks to the quality and the student experience is what I should say. We also just received a study from Civilytics. This is some pretty important information. Civilytics is run by a researcher who studied at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and worked at DPI. And he looked at the variation in revenue limits over time. So what you see here is called a box and whiskers. The box is the average in the middle of the box, and then a standard deviation at the top of the box and the bottom of the box. And each dot represents a school district. And what I wanted to show here and what they showed in this chart is that those districts at the top continue to grow and their revenue limit is increasing year over year, where districts, a lot of us, are stuck in the low revenue amount along there in those boxes. So it's kind of the old adage, the rich are getting richer. This was very interesting. So, Civilytics looked at the top quartile of revenue limit districts. In other words, those 25% of districts with the highest revenue limits, and they compared them in terms of open enrollment transfers to districts in the lower three quarters of revenue limits. They found a substantial loss of students from low revenue districts to high revenue districts. I mean, that's not just money out the door, but it's also students out the door, and our revenues are based on a per pupil amount. So it starts to compound itself based on the number of kids we're losing. It's another structural deficit for low revenue school districts. So in the 23-25 budget process, the state superintendent proposed another $1,000 for every student across the state. Now, if you look back at the red map that I showed you a few slides ago, that would not have had the impact of closing those revenue limit gaps that have been in place for 30 years. The governor recommended $1,000 per pupil. He was going to put another $200 at the bottom of the revenue limit amount. That would have helped a little bit, but would not have led to a substantial closing of revenue limit gaps that have existed again for 30 years. AEF proposed $1,500 in revenue limit increases, plus an increase related to inflation. Our position was that it was important that all districts see an increase to take care of issues like staffing and benefit costs, fuel costs, et cetera. Our intention is not to take away from those lucky districts and those students at the top, but to ask the legislature to lift from the bottom up. The Joint Finance Committee then came back with a $1,000 increase on the low revenue amount, plus $325 more in the second year. So low revenue districts got $1,325 per pupil. Everybody else got $650. So we got a 13% increase in per pupil revenues. Now, Governor Evers signed that budget, and that you'll remember that he did a line item veto to make the $325 per pupil go on for about 400 years. And that's going to come back, and we'll talk about that as we think about how AEF is positioned for the next budget cycle. But here's where we got. And we're very proud of the progress on the map here. Really a lot of improvement in terms of variability in per pupil revenues. The districts in blue and black are still well above the rest, but we were very pleased with the amount of progress that was made by the legislature and the governor in terms of the per pupil low revenue amount. So by the end of the biennium, this school year, 255 districts are at what is the de facto low revenue amount. The actual low revenue amount is still 11,000, but everybody got the additional 325, and another 103 districts fall within 10% of that amount, which is about 12,450. 85% of districts are within 10% of that low revenue amount, and 44% of districts get quite a bit more, and 19 school districts get 25% or more over the low revenue districts. So I was at the Capitol just a few weeks ago, and I was asked John, what's AEF's ultimate goal? Which I thought was a very important and meaningful question coming from a very key legislative staff member. We know that low revenue districts have been unfairly funded for 30 years. We know that there are significant student impacts in terms of ratios and open enrollment losses and more impacts. We know that the last budget made good progress, but we're asking that the legislature not stop there, that after 3 decades of inequitable funding, one budget cycle didn't fix the situation. And by the way, I've made it clear to legislators that AEF is not going to be asking for reparations or catch-up funding or anything like that. We're just saying, make this equitable, make this even. So our goal set by our steering committee is that 90% of districts are funded within 10% of each other on a per pupil basis. Let's talk about that. We're asking basically that the legislature do the same thing again, add 1325 to the bottom, and that would bring the 30-year revenue limit system to a reasonable close. Here's the distribution, the histogram of the revenue limits and what that would look like if the legislature did step up. So you'd have a lot of districts below the red line there, the red arrow. We'd have 90% of districts within 10% of each other. 110% of 12,650 is 13,915. So we'd have 380 of the 421 districts at that number, at 13,915 or below, or 12,650 to 13,915. So the steering committee has felt that that's a reasonably equitable system. We're not looking for perfection. We don't want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. We think this is a good reasonable goal to reaching adequate levels of equity. 347 of the 421 will share the same per pupil revenue, 388, 92%. These projections include $325 revenue limits for adjustments for all students. So again, everybody would get $325 if they don't get the $1,000 in the first year, and then the second year, everybody would get $325 again. And our op-ed on this issue just came out last week. So John Geyer, again, our board president, Danny Pyatt is the board president. John Geyer is our board president. Danny Pyatt is the board president in the Antigo School District. Chad Trowbridge, I see here on our call today, is the business official in Chippewa Falls. And the three of them penned an op-ed 2 years ago at this time that laid out our proposal. One thing I really liked, I was looking at the state or the Journal Sentinel over the weekend, and I thought their little headline here in the bottom, which is what you see on the website, school funding in Wisconsin still needs urgent repairs. Progress in one budget didn't erase decades of school funding inequities. Wisconsin continues to create winners and losers through the current system. Those are, boy, if that's the soundbite that everybody can remember, that would be great, because that's what it boils down to for AEF. So we know that SAA and the school boards and DPI are prioritizing special education funding with some sufficient. A per pupil revenue increase, it looks like 415 and 430, and a per pupil categorical increase of $100 per student per year. And it looks like their third priority will be an increase in the low revenue amount to 12.5. Now, that's very meaningful to me, because if the legislature and joint finance in particular chooses to connect with that third data point, that will basically allow them to say that their proposal would be a bipartisan proposal, and that would be a big win. But I think key conservatives are not quite as bought in on going from 30% funding for special education to 60% funding. I think conservatives that I've spoken with have felt that the more you add to special education, the more kids are going to qualify. They see it as never being able to dial back the funding because of federal maintenance of effort requirements. So I'm not sure they're going to buy in on 60% for special education funding. I think they also believe, and what they've told me is that they think the Evers 400-year veto is going to be upheld, and that's the number that they will probably go with. So that brings them to potentially the third number here, which is what they acted on in the last budget, which I think is the very positive for AEF. So our number one priority is the low revenue amount. We have their attention of key legislators. Again, the big question that I was asked right out of the chute, what's AEF's ultimate goal? It's 90% within 10%. Another legislator asked me what's an adequate amount of funding? And I want to come back to that in a minute because it was very interesting to hear that question unsolicited because it tells you what people are thinking about in key offices in the legislature. The governor's veto, I think the 400 or the 325, I think it's going to be an easy thing for legislators on the conservative side to say, Governor Evers wanted $325 per pupil. That's what he's going to get. And so when you go back to the three asks from SAA school boards and DPI, they probably won't get 60%. I don't know. It'd be great if they did, and the AEF is in full support of that issue. But our number one issue, I think, can be something that we can look forward to getting good support for. We've got a lot of trust and confidence and good communications at the Capitol, positive and respectful relationships. I think our focus on revenue limits has been really critical. And when I meet with Democratic lawmakers, they have a hard time agreeing that revenue limits and equity and funding are not should not be focused on as much as we say they should be. And I think it's important because, when you look at that list from the other groups, the revenue limit is not the number one issue, the low revenue ceiling, I should say. And so it's interesting and important that when I talk to Democratic legislators, and those of you who have those legislators in your school districts, make sure that they understand the issues around equity and funding. And I know they're bought in on equity with regard to academic achievement and program opportunities. It can't happen as effectively without equitable funding. It's also important to remember that the governor signed into law a connection between the revenue limit and the voucher funding. So there will be a key constituency in the legislature who want to see increases in voucher funding, who will also then potentially advocate around the low revenue amount. That's an important connection, and it was important to note that Governor Evers signed that. So again, our ultimate goal. We know that the 30-year funding system has been unfair to low revenue districts. We know that revenue limits have a significant negative impact on kids and on school districts. And we know that the last budget made good progress, but there are still significant inequities, and we can't stop there. So our goal, again, 90% within 10% on a per pupil basis. Our number two issue is going to be special education funding. And this leads into our transition now with regard to AEF's mission. We've been focused on revenue limits and the low revenue amount for, 30 years. And really in this last budget cycle, that was clearly our number one focus. But we did make a map 2 years ago that showed the transfer amount. We took a little bit of a different approach. Fund 27, all of our school officials and superintendents will know that Fund 27 is the special education fund. Fund 10 is the regular education fund, and you can't have a negative balance in your Fund 27 special education fund at the end of the year. So school districts save money in their Fund 10, and at the end of the year, they make a transfer from Fund 10 to Fund 27 to backfill any unfunded special education costs. That number is a very discrete number. We know what that number is for every school district in the state. And working with R.W. Baird and Todd Hajewski, we were able to identify that number for every district and then divide by the number of non-disabled kids in the school district. And we wanted to make a key point that unfunded special education mandates are borne on the backs of the non-disabled population in the school. We know that every school district and everybody in the state wants to do the right thing by kids with disabilities. But with inadequate funding, that money's got to come from somewhere. And that's what our message is for the state. So you probably haven't seen this map. This is new. It just was built in the last week or two. But it shows those Fund 10 to Fund 27 transfer amounts per pupil. And you can see there's some really high dollar amounts, $2,500 and over for those 15 school districts in red. We also have significant numbers in school districts all across the state, and there are only 33 school districts that have less than $1,000 per student. We're in the process of getting numbers for the 24-25 school year. And then just like the revenue limit map, I'm going to be able to show the Fund 10 to 27 transfer amounts between the 2 years. And that will show the impact that the last budget had when they promised 30% special education reimbursement. So we tell a lot of stories and do a lot of training using our maps. So what's next? After the election tomorrow, we'll continue contacting legislators and having important conversations. Again, those maps, especially for new legislators, will be really helpful in telling the story. We'll analyze DPI and the governor's budget proposals with regard to the low revenue amount. And we'll make sure that folks understand how those revenue limit amounts will impact kids all across the state. We'll make an appeal to key legislators outlining unfair revenue limit amounts in their school districts. And that's important because if we get in front of them with the inequities for even within their legislative districts, it just drives that message home. We did that for a lot of legislators in the last budget cycle, and I think it really made a difference. And the other thing, if we get about 10 new school district members, and I hate to put a pitch in here, but we've got 68. If we could get closer to 78 or even 100, it'd be fantastic. We can take take out print ads in key legislative districts when the budget cycle is a little closer, and make sure that communities know that their students are not being fairly funded compared to other kids in that same legislative district. Again, our goal not to take away from kids in the high revenue districts, but to make sure that legislators understand for 30 years there have been a large group of kids who are funded significantly lower than others. So we've got a kind of a compressed timeline. We've got the general election tomorrow. DPI should be releasing their entire budget proposal here very soon. There have been pieces of that coming out. The governor will release his budget plan in January. New legislators will be sworn in. We'll have the State of the State address. The state superintendent will have a primary election in February, and Joint Finance Committee members will be chosen. The Senate control, if it's Republican, you're likely to see some of the same key players on Joint Finance. And then there's a critical moment for us, the caucus meetings. I was very happy to hear that AEF's maps were present in caucuses this last budget cycle. And it's important to note that we're having an impact, and people are using the information that we're creating because they trust it and they want to hear about fairness and revenues all across the state. We've got the state superintendent election in April, then of course budget hearings, and then in May the Joint Finance Committee will make a budget proposal. There'll be all kinds of backroom wrangling. We'll make sure we have a presence to make sure legislators understand our position, and then probably in June the budget will be signed by the governor. So what you can do if you're not if you're not already on my mailing list, I'm not sure how you got here today, but you can send me an email. I'd be happy to include you on our mailing list. I encourage folks to send out things from our mailing list, like the op-ed that was just in the Milwaukee Journal just the other day. I encourage you to testify at those joint finance hearings. Try to arrive very early, sign up. I get there, I try to be first or second in line, and I'm typically testifying by 9 or 9:30 in the morning. And it's good to get the legislators when they're fresh and able to still understand and hear everything we're talking about. If you're not a member, please consider joining. It's not expensive. Our student educated number, that 83,000 students, those things matter. And we're not organized to be like WRSA, WASDA, or school boards. We have a narrow focus and a very solid footprint. We've made a real impact. Just look at our maps. It's meaningful stuff. If you're considering a referendum, I just want to think for a moment about the impact that a revenue limit increase like the 1325 would have on your budget. And I came up with a new marketing scheme. A revenue limit increase is forever, WAEF. I thought that was a good takeoff. So Our future may include a conversation about what an adequate amount of funding is, and obviously important question, but wondering about maybe a system overhaul or looking at funding through the lens of what it costs to actually educate individual students, considering disability status, free and reduced lunch status, English learner, other variables that may be related to demographics in the school district with regard to cost of living. Um, Inflationary increases, things like that, transportation costs. If AEF gets us to 90% within 10%, we have to ask an important question. What comes next for AEF? So I'm going to stop there. My contact information is available. We're right at 12:30. I think that's a good place to wrap it up here. And I'm going to stop our recording.